Oh, isn't that nice? Very exciting. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and it is so wonderful to be with everybody tonight, and I want to give a special welcome to those in simulcast. So we have quite a crowd here tonight. And you know what I'm going to say now? Turn your phones off. I know you see this face and you turn your phone off. I know that. Well, yes, you do have to be reminded. It's true. This is a very exciting week at Hillwood. This weekend, Natural Beauties, Exquisite Works of Minerals and Gems opens in the Dacha. And all of our members are invited to come to the preview of the exhibition all day Friday. Wilfred Zeisler, who's the curator, will be giving talks right here about the show. And I can't tell you, it is so beautiful. You'll love it. It's just great. But of course, tonight, we are going to explore grand homes and elaborate gardens of the notable denizens of Long Island's Gold Coast. And of course, I'm sure you know, Marjorie Post was one of them. Of course, Hillwood is Post's lasting legacy, and by the time she had purchased the estate, she had really honed her approach to shaping the enchanting gardens we have here. She worked with and learned from some of the preeminent landscape architects and garden designers, including Marion Coffin and Innocenti and Fabled, and I have a sneaking suspicion we're going to hear a little bit about some of them tonight. I've spent the last few years exploring the rich resources in our archives, both here and at the Bentley in Michigan, researching Hillwood's Post's approach to gardens, and the gardens especially here at Hillwood. And I'm absolutely thrilled to tell you that my new book, A Garden for All Seasons, Marjorie Merriweather Post's Hillwood, will be published by Rizzoli in April. Wow. Yes, yes. And I know you're going to hang on my every word, but I'm absolutely sure the reason why you'll buy the book is because the photography by Eric Kowalczyk is absolutely extraordinary. We had him photograph for 2 years, and of course we had him photograph the garden in every season, hence A Garden for All Seasons, and it's just sensational. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing the book with all of you, and I will be giving the launch lecture for the book here on April 15th. So you heard it here first. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. CeCe Haydock is a New York State landscape architect. After working in the New York City Parks Department as a site engineer, she joined the firm of Innocenti and Fabled in Locust Valley before founding her own practice. For the past 25 years, she's been working on predominantly residential projects, but she's also done municipal parks and commercial sites using a classical design palette. She focuses on sustainability and green building. She's a LEED accredited landscape architect, and that's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, LEED. And she has served as the project manager for the Sustainable Sites Initiative. She's an officer of the American Society of Landscape Architects, a member of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Classical America, the Edith Wharton Society, and the Mount. She serves as a trustee of the Planting Fields Arboretum State Historic Park in Oyster Bay, New York, and on the International Council of the Preservation Society of Newport County. CeCe is also adjunct professor at Long Island University and a visiting lecturer at the New York Botanic Garden. She's a graduate of Princeton University, and she received her master's degree in landscape architecture from the SUNY School of Environmental Science and Forestry. So please join me in welcoming CeCe.
Thank you so much, Kate. It is such a pleasure to be at Hillwood again. I came about 2 years ago, not knowing that I'd be speaking tonight, and got a chance to walk around the obviously amazing gardens as well as the house. And I also want to thank Erin Laurie, who booked me for this evening, as well as all of the other 14 speakers that she books every year. I'm very impressed with that. And I want to say hello to all those in the other buildings that are here. I've never been on thank you. You knew I was looking for that word. So it's a pleasure. So good evening, everybody. So tonight we're going to talk about the fabled gardens of Long Island's Gold Coast. And you probably want to know, well, what are the gardens, or where is this area that we're talking about? This is a map of Long Island, adjacent to New York, and this is the area that was known as the Gold Coast, and still is by many people. And it was predominantly an area that the rich industrialists of the 1895 to 1920, where they built their big houses. It was the most affluent area near New York, and it was the most affluent area in the metropolitan area. So what is today the Hamptons, in the early 1900s was the Gold Coast. And the area stretched from, on the west, Great Neck, to the east, Huntington, and as south as Old Westbury. So we'll look at some of those gardens. There were built about 500 of these estates and gardens. So there were many, many houses. And today there are about 200 left. And they are schools, private museums, still a few private homes are in existence, and the Russian embassy has their own dacha in one of the old Gold Coast houses in Glen Cove, and it's still the Russians are there, and I have, yes, thank you, they are listening, and I have not visited as much as I would like. This is a wonderful placemat that a friend of mine sent me that shows the North Shore of Long Island, which is sometimes synonymous with the Gold Coast. And if you look, you'll see many of the names that we're going to look at tonight, and I circled them. We have Vanderbilt and Woolworth, and you can read the rest, because I can't read slanted. So what was the style of architecture that was the predominant architecture of the time? Before, in the mid to late 1880s, Victorian architecture was the prominent design that people followed, as well as colonial architecture. But there was a phenomenon. It was called Beaux-Arts architecture. And many of the architects, American architects, and their clients traveled in Europe and participated in what was known in the 18th or 17th century as the Grand Tour, and visited many houses. And in addition, architects from the US studied in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, and this is a picture of them. I think there's one woman there, but maybe not. But there is one female graduate that I know of. And many of these architects returned to the US and built buildings such as were on display at the 1893 World's Fair, the Chicago World's Fair. And this was, if you will, the coming out party for the Beaux-Arts design style. Beaux-Arts plannings is represented by symmetry, by axial roads, by similar cornice heights of the buildings, monuments that catch your eye and pull your eye out there. So I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about the houses that, and of course we'll visit. I think it's about 12 or 13, along with Marjorie Merriweather Poe's house. We'll visit some of these houses. I call it Beaux-Arts plus. They were, and the Beaux-Arts style was promulgated by the school, and it was generally an emphasis on neoclassical design, using imperial and Renaissance Rome as the models for the design style. It was a classical style. And in the North Shore, in the Gold Coast area, many of the houses were strictly Beaux-Arts, but also English Tudor, French Chateau, Georgian, Gothic, Mediterranean, Norman, Spanish, and then a combination of all these. And what I really like is the eclectic nature of many of these houses. And in the U.S., yes, we do have very pure architecture, but there's a desire to pull in different styles from Europe and South America and Asia. And you'll see many of these examples in the houses we'll look at. I'm going to spend more time on some houses and gardens than others because I know some better than others. For instance, one of the ones we'll look at was actually in my old neighborhood, and I used to walk there with a friend, and we would explore what was left. The main house has been removed, but there are many, many outbuildings. I am also going to talk about a garden, not so much as a horticulture feature, but as the form of the hardscape and the buildings. So we're not going to be looking at a lot of gardens. This is probably the most gardeny slide I have. But we have got some very pretty gardens. So what does F. Scott Fitzgerald have to do with my talk tonight? As many of you know, he wrote The Great Gatsby. He started The Great Gatsby in Great Neck, New York in 1922. And he spent the next 2 years writing in Great Neck and then traveled to Paris where he finished The Great Gatsby. And this is the house that he lived in. Not a substantially huge house, but he was friends with many of the people. He was a young, attractive man, and his wife Zelda was energetic and very social. So they were highly popular in the social set. And as you know, The Great Gatsby describes the type of life that was being led in excess in many ways. But many of the details of The Great Gatsby comes from how people were living in the 1920s, and particularly on Long Island. So this is a fake house. It was built in Australia for the movie done by Baz Luhrmann, The Great Gatsby. This is, I think, the third Great Gatsby, and this looks plenty real, I suppose, but it was fake. It was totally constructed for the movie, and I'm not quite sure why in Australia, but probably had a little bit to do with money. And it's a wonderful representation of what Jay Gatsby's house could have looked like. And as you may remember, he was a polo player. He liked polo, or he affected that he was a polo player. And so here we have a polo player in the front lawn garden, a little far-fetched, but who cares? It's a movie and it's fiction. But that house is very similar to what Fitzgerald himself wrote about Jay Gatsby's house. And there aren't a lot of descriptions of Jay Gatsby's house, but there is this one. Excuse me, this is Tom Buchanan's house. Tom and Daisy Buchanan were the couple in Great Gatsby. Jay Gatsby fell in love with Daisy Buchanan. And this is what Daisy and Jay Buchanan's house might have looked like, according to Fitzgerald, who calls it, quote, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay, with a sunken garden and a half acre of roses. So you get the feeling of a formal house, in this case Georgian, and a very full and alive garden. So what did Jay Gatsby's house look like? And many people claim on Long Island that they know the exact house that was Jay Gatsby's. But I have been informed by the Nassau County, which is the county we live in that has most of these houses, that there was no one Jay Gatsby house, that it was amalgamation of many different houses. But this one seems to fit. This was a house built by Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who was first married to a Vanderbilt, divorced him, and then married Mr. Belmont, O.H.P. Belmont, and after he died, she built this house, which is called Beacon Towers. It was built in 1917, so just before Fitzgerald arrived on Long Island and just before he began writing the Gatsby. And it does seem to have many of the features of how Fitzgerald described Jay Gatsby's house. And I quote, "A colossal affair, a factual imitation of some Hôtel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin bank of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of formal lawn and garden." So you can see that the architectural style that Fitzgerald describes is very similar to this house. But keep in mind, there was no one house. This house was torn down. It was sold to William Hearst, and it was torn down in 1937, sadly. So let's now talk about Marjorie Merriweather Post, who owned a house in Brookville, Long Island, also called Hillwood. This was a Tudor house, a kind of rambling, half timbered, not a colossal mansion that you might imagine, such as Belmont Towers, for instance. And it had numerous outbuildings, including a house for her daughter from her first marriage. And I love this little factoid. The water for a newly designed stream came from the icebox overflow. So sustainability in action, I would say. There were very large trees planted. And this is E.F. Hutton, her second husband. And this photograph was taken at the Meadowbrook Polo Club in Old Westbury. Just about the time that a man named Tom Hitchcock was playing polo, and he was a real person. And many think that Tom Buchanan, Tom Buchanan was modeled after this Tommy Hitchcock. So, and we know that Fitzgerald himself went to polo matches, as did Marjorie Merriweather Post and her husband E.F. Hutton. So you can imagine that their paths crossed. I don't have any specific information that talks about how Fitzgerald met, but Nancy Rubin, who wrote the biography of Marjorie Merriweather Post, makes the point that Mr. and Mrs. Hutton were a couple that Fitzgerald might have modeled Tom and Daisy after. She was a beautiful woman. He was somewhat new. He was new money, Mr. Hutton, as was Tom Buchanan. And Fitzgerald describes Tom and Daisy as a careless couple. And Nancy Rubin, the biographer of Marjorie Merriweather Post, said, well, the Huttons weren't necessarily careless, but they were carefree. I was fascinated. I didn't know this before I did research for this talk tonight, but there's a real overlap. The house and gardens were designed, as Kate mentioned, she mentioned the landscape architect Marion Kruger Coffin, who was one of the first female landscape architects who did this elaborate plan for Hillwood. And today Hillwood, the house still exists, the gardens, the horticulture doesn't so much, but there are still the masonry, there's a pergola, I've walked around it, and you can see bits and pieces of it. But just look how elaborate this, oops, oh, I hit the wrong button, but luckily nothing happened. So here's the house, and then all this is the garden with the tennis court and a putting green. So it was really a place for both of them who enjoyed sports, who enjoyed golf very much. And I like this caption that Marion Kruger Coffin wrote on one of her photographs that we now have. She says, and I quote, "The landscape should suggest the mystery of unseen areas, much as life itself presents the constant suspense of leading on to an unpredictable future." End of quote. And that kind of reminds me a little bit of Marjorie Merriweather's post Joie de Vivre, her love of exploration, of philanthropy, of collections, of discovery. And in many ways, she did have an unpredictable future. It unfolded. And the trees that were first installed were huge trees, 20 or 30 feet high, by the local landscape nursery that I once upon a time worked for before they closed. But they were known for importing the biggest trees, and it was an instant landscape. The boxwood shrubs were all fully grown and full, so it was, when it was installed, it was a real garden. Oh, I did it. Oh, phew. I can't. There's one button that stops the show, and I know which one it is, but okay, I'm going to just control. So the first house that we're going to look at after the Hutton's house and the various Gatsby-like houses is Meudon, or Meudon, and it was designed after, or it was copied after, a house in France built for Louis XIV's son, Meudon. And the French Meudon was also on a hill, on a very steep hill, occupied a terraced, steeply sloping site. The owner and builder of Meudon, William Guthrie, was a lawyer to the Rockefellers. He also was an educator. He acquired 30 acres and 300 acres. That's the right number. And to do that, buckle your seatbelt, he had to basically raze an existing village. He had to destroy an existing village. Laddingtown, New York, once upon a time had a post office and small buildings, and Mr. Guthrie came into town and he wanted it, so it was gone. Try doing that today, right? 60 buildings were torn down in addition to the post office, and while the village still exists, it doesn't have any center to it. There were 3 houses on the state that were part of the power system in addition to the main house. Oh, and that's Meudon in France, that it was loosely designed after. This is one of the pictures of the plants that were taken in their plant boxes in the winter, and they were placed in these greenhouses. There were 7 greenhouses. There's still one left, and the head house is now a residence. There were 100 gardeners. And you can understand why. It was a very elaborate landscape with 300 acres, and the house itself was 80 rooms. You needed a lot of staff. And there were stables and farm buildings, dairy, servants' quarters, kennels, a turkey house, as I mentioned, a power system. So in fact, it was its own little village. So you didn't really need Laddingtown because you had Meudon. Today, as I mentioned, the house is no longer existing, but you can see some of the. Oh, and there's the terrace going down from the house, and that goes to the water. Mr. Guthrie excavated a canal so he could bring his boat in and commute to work. And that's the canal that he created, which still exists today, and his bathhouse is now the community bathhouse for that neighborhood. And I really like this photograph. This was taken from the 1970s Vogue or some fashion magazine. And this is one of the remnants left on the estate. You can see there's weeds and there's no more water in the fountain. It's very romantic and evocative, and it reminds me of a classical detail. And on the left is Hadrian's villa outside of Rome. It's called Hadrian's Villa, and you have this curved column connected by the masonry on the top. And so this gives you an idea of the type of things that the Beaux-Arts architects learned when they were on their grand tour. And that's a loggia that looks out towards the west and the setting sun, but today it's been completely blocked in by landscape architect's greatest enemy, the Norway maple. And those were all Norway maples. But you can imagine sitting there and looking at the sunset. And once again, very classical design, classical balustrade. The loggia has got very symmetrical and in the Roman style. Our next house is Westbury House in Old Westbury Garden. This house is existing today. It's run by a private foundation based on the endowment of the Phipps family. And it was built by John Phipps, who was the son of Henry Phipps, who had the very good fortune to be a classmate, childhood friend of Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie and Henry Phipps and no doubt others created the great industry, the steel industry of Carnegie, and before the age of income tax, became very, very rich. John Phipps, son of Henry, built this house between 1904 and 1906, so the beginning of the 1900s. Meuden, which we just saw, was built in 1899, I believe. So we're roughly going in chronology. I'm going to cheat a little bit, but roughly. The house is a Charles II designed house. The wife of John Phipps was English, and she wanted a house very similar to what she was used to growing up in England. This is an overview of the house, and if you look, you'll see one tennis court, two tennis courts. So, whoops, how's that go away? Uh-oh. All right, let's just see. Well, hopefully that will go away in a minute. Oh, no. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm just going to sit tight and talk about the tennis courts. So there were often a tennis court on these very large houses, but having two lawn tennis courts was, in my mind, a real luxury. But they had 4 children, the Phipps, Marguerite and John, and one of the daughters lived there until about 10 years ago. So it was very much a house for a family. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Okay, oh, thank you. Oh, but what do I do with that red dot? All right, well, I'm going to keep talking, and Erin, if you can save me, that would be wonderful. These are 2 sphinxes that...
1 second, I'm going to mute the screen and work some magic.
Yay, yay.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll keep talking about Old Westbury Gardens. Not only did Marguerite want an English house, but she also wanted an English garden. So her husband built for her a 2.5-acre walled garden, and we'll look at that in a minute. In the house, most of the house itself is Georgian period Georgian furniture, and there are a number of paintings by Rennell and Gainsborough and John Singer Sargent. The gardens are boxwood gardens, Italian gardens, so again, an eclectic mix. There's a ghost walk of trained hemlocks, which is recently being restored because hemlocks are at risk of disease, so they're being restored. Swans and ducks, wild ducks fill the lakes. There are 2 lakes. The attendance grows every year, and they continue to survive on a private budget. Should I do anything?
Just ignore the red dot.
It'll be kind of a game, see where it lands on each slide. So these two sphinxes are right outside the dining room, looking towards the tennis courts. And sphinxes are, I don't know about you, but I love Instagram, and I learn a lot about it. And I have a lot of English and Italian sites, and every time, not every time, but many, many times I look at an English garden and there's a sphinx in the garden. So this is another view of the house. I said it was the dining room, it's the ballroom. And the two sphinxes on the left are Old Westbury, and then on the right is Bouscat Hall in England. So this is very much an attempt to bring all the things that Mrs. Phipps grew up with in England. The garden is formally designed. This is a side axis, and it looks out onto a duck pond and then a reflecting pool. And then look, you see in the back, let me see if I can get that red dot to move. Oh, we did. Okay, and then there we have that curved colonnade again. And this is a theme that not on purpose, but I kept finding in the houses I looked at. The reflecting pool, that's it from another angle. And it's very reminiscent. When I visited the Getty Villa in Malibu, California last year, which is a replication of an ancient Roman villa. And look at the similarities. So this is something that the architects and many of the owners, because many of the owners went on Grand Tour, they were familiar with these different features of European gardens. That's the path leading to that's inside the 2.5-acre walled garden with this extraordinary pergola wrapping around the reflecting pool. The design is of Old Westbury Gardens. Old Westbury Gardens is French. The designer was a French designer, and there's some Dutch elements to it, and then of course the influence of Italians. This sweet little, that's the playhouse, and it looks just like that. It's this, excuse me, I'm going to pull up my stool. It's this little thatched cottage, and you look in the window and you see miniature chairs and tea sets and whatnot. On the outside is a cottage garden that is a great way, and plants are labeled, so it's a great way for us if you want to understand what a cottage garden looks like, what type of plants, such as hollyhocks and I can't see. I see helianthus, some sunflowers, but you can use this as a guide to what you might use in your own cottage garden. The garden is very well maintained. Like Hillwood, it has a very supportive membership. Across the street is another Phipps house that was built quite later than Westbury House. This is called Ercles, which was built in 1931. It was built by the brother of John Phipps, Howard Phipps. And he was living, the Phipps had been buying up a lot of farmland in the area, and he'd been living on a farmhouse. And then he got engaged a little bit. He was a little bit older than his brother, and he was engaged to a woman, and whomever decided to build a house called Ercles. And Ercles is a name inspired by a castle in Scotland. So the original designs were very baronial, very formal. Not at all like this house. So I love this little detail. So after the wedding and after house construction had begun, his new wife, Harriet, halted construction. And she said she wanted a less baronial house. She was from Virginia, and she wanted architecture that was more Virginia-like. So hence, the castle turned into a Virginia house. plant collection is astounding, and this is privately owned. I have to say, at this moment, it's actually being sold, and scuttlebutt has it that it's being subdivided. I know, but it's 127 acres. The house is in immaculate condition. The current Howard Phipps, he's the great-grandson of the man who built it, is elderly, and it's time for the family to sell. And this is a fabulous English sunken garden, very gentle, not a dramatic sunken garden, but the plant material on either side of this lawn is just beautifully designed. I study it because it gives me a perfect example of how simply to do a flower border with repetition, color, and height. Those are the Chinese pavilions used as changing rooms for the tennis court and the pool. And that fountain has the most magical sound when you walk by it. And it's a very calm and settling place to visit. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Garden Conservancy Open Days Tour, but it's an organization, a national organization that arranges for private gardens to be open to the public. And I know Georgetown and Washington has open days, and the owners of Aircliffs allow people to visit in early June, and the plant material sensational. The garden design, and it's a little hard to see, but this is one spoke of an alley that is in the shape of a sundial, and the house is the center point of the sundial, and then alleys of beech trees come out from that dial. Features around the garden are not too much, just right. Attractive fountains and steps, of course. There's a little bit of topography. And this is Howard Phipps, who was an avid horticulturalist. He loved rhododendrons, and he was very well known for hybridizing rhododendron. And today the gardener who works at Aircliffs continues this tradition of hybridizing rhododendron. And this is what it looks like in June. These are, this is one of the walks, one of the walks on the sundial, and it's just overflowing with azaleas, as I hear Hillwood is in the spring. I haven't visited in the spring, but I bet it's very similar. And that's a view of the rhododendron looking out towards it's an open field, and it's a busy road that this house is on. It's set back from the road, so you don't feel it when you're at the house and in the garden. But I drive by frequently, and it's so refreshing on Long Island, busy Long Island, to see this open field. And sadly, I guess it won't be around for that long. Our next house is Eagle's Nest actually in Suffolk County, which is the neighboring county to Nassau County, where the houses we've been looking at were located. And this is a really interesting little amalgamation of buildings, and it's referred to as a mansion, but I would call it more of like a little itty-bitty village. And there's the gate bridge crossing into the quote-unquote village, which was the house. And you have to enter through this gate with this very serious portcullis, which is used for marauding armies to protect you from being invaded. Well, there's no marauding armies on Long Island, nor were they when the house was built. And for the longest time, I thought this portcullis was fake. It was just for show, but it's not. I saw it one time in the down position. So you walk, see, there it is, it's down. So you walk in, and it's now a museum open to the public. It's funded by Suffolk County, so it's it's limping along a little bit, but it's nonetheless popular. It's of Spanish design, and it was started in 1910 and then was completed and redone over time and completed in 1937. It has 24 rooms, and it was built by William K. Vanderbilt. He was obviously, I believe, is the grandson of the Commodore Vanderbilt, but one of the members of the family with a great deal of money. And this was one of the houses that he wanted to live in on Long Island. And it's 43 acres with, and there's another view. And you can see it's quirky. There's sort of some main buildings, and then they're connected by these loggias with all sorts of different gardens. There's a Spanish garden, an interior Spanish garden, next to a Roman-style dressing room and bath with an Italian pink marble tub carved from a single block of stone. And that's what it looks like. It's right on the water. It looks out at the beautiful, at this moment, the beautiful Long Island Sound, and that's a little wisp of land, a little bit of land, a barrier island, a barrier peninsula adjacent to it. That's the Spanish Garden. And in 1924, William K. Vanderbilt was married a couple of times, and he decided to make it really Spanish, this house, and that's what it looks like today. So he dispatched the architect to Spain to study Spanish architecture. That's a view, and this is a little bit more of an Italian garden with the boxwood hedges and the Italian olive jar there. And then we've got the sundial, which I think is magnificent on the side of the building, a really beautiful feature to the exterior of the house. And I was traveling in northern Portugal, and I had already seen this house and done research on it, and I knew the Spanish part. I knew the Spanish influence very well of this house. And when I was in northern Portugal, I saw, this was at the Matus estate, and I saw this chapel, and it so reminded me of on the left, the side entrance of Eagle's Nest, and I could see the influence. Again, not an exact copy. Architects are very rarely do exact copies, but there's all these influences. And to me, and northern Portugal borders on Spain, so they're very closely geographically allied. The paving over the bridge is interesting, and I love to look down. I'm looking at drains and paving, and the stone paving includes details that represent the Vanderbilt family. The acorn is a Vanderbilt family symbol, and there it is embedded. So when you walk over this bridge and enter the bungalow house little village, that's what you see. And once again, we have those colonnades. This time they're not connected at the top, but one of the things I read was that the Vanderbilts claim these columns are from ancient Carthage. Well, I don't know. I just don't buy that. But it's a good story. And there's that's on the upper left is Hadrian's villa again. This is a different part of Hadrian Villa, the ancient Roman villa outside of Rome. And so you can see the influence of these columns as part of the design of the gardens. At the entrance, and this is a true story because there is a plaque to prove it. These two very oversized eagles, out of proportion to the front entrance, actually came from the second Grand Central building. It was called Grand Central Depot, and the Vanderbilts built Grand Central Depot. And William K. Vanderbilt basically stole. I don't know. I guess his family gave him these two eagles, or he said, "I want them," and they said, "Okay." And there is a plaque, and you can see it testifies a testament to the fact that they came from Grand Central Depot. And if you go to the east side of today's Grand Central Terminal, you'll actually see an eagle that looks like this, but you have to really look for it. It's not very obvious. This is William K. Vanderbilt. He was really an interesting man. He was an avid explorer. He created on this property, the 23 acres, the so-called Hall of Fishes, which on his yacht, he went and he collected samples, aquatic samples of fish and crustaceans, and this was before the Museum of Natural History was built. So this was a private collection. So this was one of the first private collections of aquatic plants. I'm sorry, aquatic animals and crustaceans, and in this same Hall of Fishes is his diving suit, and it looks like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's pretty old, but he loved exploring. He also loved car racing. Created the first turnpike on Long Island, and I'll just sit for a minute with him. And one thing that I really regret is that I didn't take my children to see the most amazing dioramas. Very similar to what we see at the Museum of Natural History, dioramas of lions and tigers and bears, and they're all in the main building, not in the Hall of Fishes, but in the main building. So it's charming. I mean, it's more than charming. It's eclectic and interesting, and you understand this man who had great wealth, how he was just interested in a lot of different things. Our next house is quite close by, Oheka Castle, and this is the same building that is on, excuse me, I'm looking at my watch, is on is the first slide of this talk. This was built by Otto Hermann Kahn. He was Jewish and was not allowed to join the local country clubs because he was Jewish, and he was a financier. He had a lot of money, and he built his own house with his own golf course, with his own I think he had a small airplane strip. He had everything. The name Oheka is not Indian, as you may think, but it's actually a shortening of his name, Otto, O, Herman, H-E, Otto, Oheka, and then K-A for Khan. So I like that, how he said, I'm putting my name on this house in a very personal way. The gardens were designed by Olmsted Brothers, who designed many, many Long Island estates. This is obviously very formal garden. This is what's left today. There was many more gardens, but it was restored in 1980, and it's now a destination wedding site and hotel. You can also have lunch there. The current owner, who has given his heart and soul to restoring this house, lives in a 5,000 square foot apartment right here, overlooking that formal garden. It was loosely designed after Chateau Fontainebleau in Paris by Delano and Aldrich, very famous Beaux-Arts architects of the time. And this is beautiful. This shows you the combination of mature boxwood and fountains. With a gravel walk that you can hear the sound beneath your feet. And I love details, because I do details as a landscape architect, and the coping, this coping right here, if you look, it's not just a straight line across, which is what we do today, but it's keyed, which is a much more solid way of holding masonry in place, but it's also more expensive because you have wasted stone. And then this lovely curbing, which has curves to it, and it's not just a straight edging. There's an indoor swimming pool that looks out on what was the golf course. Our next house was also designed by Delano and Aldrich. This is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's studio in Old Westbury, and it was built as a house for Mrs. Whitney. She was married, obviously, to a Whitney, and he had other interests. He was interested in polo. She was a well-known artist of the time, and she wanted to give her collection when she was getting older. She wanted to bequeath her collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they said, no, we don't want it, because she wasn't considered mainstream. She was slightly progressive, but also not as established as some other sculptors, and she also was going to give money for a wing for the Metropolitan Museum, and they still said no. So she built her own museum, with the Whitney Museum, and as many of you know, it has just opened. It's moved downtown New York. So this is her legacy, this great sculpture collection, and she was very supportive of other progressive designers. So this is the landscape plan of the studio, and you can see how this is the house. It's quite a small house, designed after an Italian garden casino, such as at Villa Lante. Then there's a very strong north-south axis that goes right through the front door, out the back door, the terrace, and then a garden beyond. And you can see it's just a straight shot, so very formal. This is what the front looks like. This was when she was living there, and then today, the descendants who are living there, they've built a driveway so they can park in front. But pretty much, it's unchanged. They had to sell off some of the property because taxes. But the house itself and the gardens is pretty much unchanged. That's the rear sunken garden, which to me is one of the most magical gardens I've ever seen. And I couldn't really understand why I was captivated by it until I started looking at it carefully. It's not a sunken garden has walls that are the same height. It's actually tilted towards your eye. So the bottom plane of the garden is like this. This is where the statue is in the back, and then the swimming pool is here. So it brings the plane of the garden towards you. And I'm still trying to figure out who was the brilliant person who designed that, or if it was an accident. I don't know, but it has a really interesting effect when you're sitting right there. That's the terrace where the family sits, and then of course the swimming pool, and so this garden is almost brought towards you. That's looking at it from the terrace towards the back. You can see a little bit about the grade change, and the current owner said to me, I said, why is the plane tilted up towards you? And he said, well, I think it's so that the gravity works for this rill, which goes through the center of it and deposits the water in the swimming pool. And he may have a point, but I prefer to have the more, scholarly, designy answer to it. Her Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's sculpture is throughout the garden. There was recently an exhibit of her work in Palm Beach, and then at Planting Fields, and then it moved to Newport, Planting Fields in Oyster Bay, which we'll see in a minute, and it may go to Paris. So there's been a resurgence of interest, and her grandchildren reissued a biography of her. That's a sarcophagus, and just so it's got some asphalt paper on top of it. This is a working garden, and you'll see another. This is the twin sarcophagus, and the mother of the current owner, who since died, was an avid gardener. So she's using this sarcophagus as one of her planting tables, which I love. But I'm also intrigued, or I'm captivated by the light on the terracotta pots. And this was a working garden. It's less so now because she doesn't have anybody as keen on gardening as she was. Our next house, which I just mentioned, is Planting Fields. This was built in 1916 to 21. It replaced an existing building that was built, designed by Grosvenor Atterbury, who was a famous architect. The owners of Planting Fields were William Coe and his wife, the former May Rogers Coe, and she had a great deal of money. She brought a lot of money to the marriage, and he started from the bottom up, made a fortune in insurance, and they moved into the preceding house, but sadly it burned down, and so they rebuilt the house. It was designed by I'll tell you in a minute because I can't remember. It was designed by Beaux-Arts architects Walker and Gillette. The Olmsted brothers were the main landscape architects of the nearly 400 acres, and today it still is intact. It was given to the state of New York, and there's a private foundation of which I'm the vice chair, and we work with the state to preserve the house and the landscape. That's the tea house, which in the interior has a design by Elsie de Wolf, the designer, and it looks out onto, and there's the interior, very sweet interior. And that is the bedroom of May Rogers Coe. It was actually redone. The murals, the original murals were sold, and a few years ago we raised money and had a facsimile created. So it looks like this today. It looks fantastic, and we're slowly restoring the rooms, the bathrooms, and the bedrooms. And the landscaping, because we have the New York State Parks on our side, is really beautiful, and we have a lot of volunteers, such as you have at Hillwood. This is the Italian garden with the so-called blue pool, which you wouldn't have blue tiles in an Italian pool, but it was used for swimming, so it's got its American flavor to it. And there's the Italian loggia. The house itself is English Tudor, and Walker and Gillette designed an Italian loggia on the side of it, which is often used for wedding photographs. But I'm always amused because it's an English Tudor house, but it's got this very Italianate feature that's attached to it. The greenhouse, the camellia greenhouse, was very beloved by Mr. Coe. He had a camellia collection that was mighty impressive. This is a small pool when you walk into this greenhouse. And our final house, Templeton, was built in 1930 by Carrere and Hastings, the architects, and I just want you to look at something that you may. Oh, these are the two architects. This is inside the public library, which they designed, a New York City public library. On the left is Carrere, and on the right is Hastings. And Mr. Hastings, at a speech in 1915, gave this talk, talking about the immediate exterior of the house, how important it was that be designed with the house itself, so that there was this connection between the inside of the house and outside. And that's very much an Italian Renaissance theme, that you have this flow from the house to the garden. And right here in Washington, we have a Carrere and Hastings building, and I found this old photograph of it. As many of you know, there's currently a controversy going on about what type of style of architecture federal architecture should be going forward, and the president has requested that it be very much in this style, and the American Institute of Architects and many other groups have said, no, that will squash architectural inspiration. So that's the type of architecture which we see throughout Washington. And Carrere and Hastings did one of the first buildings. So back to this very American-looking house, also designed by Carrere and Hastings. It was built by the philanthropist Alfred DuPont, and then it was sold to the Guest family. And these are some of the, it's now owned by a college, and they have their administrative buildings in the house. And sadly, there's some problem, obviously, with funding and keeping the masonry in good restored shape. But I show this picture because I want you to see how these steps are designed. So when you're inside a house, or even when you're going into a subway, say in New York City, the steps are very steep because the designers don't have a lot of horizontal space. It's tight in a city. So that the so-called risers, which is the vertical part of the step, is quite high. This is inside a building. Outside, it's very different. We designers want to make a leisurely movement from one level to another. So we make the risers very short, say 4 or 5 inches, and then the horizontal part of the step quite wide, 14 inches. So when you're walking around, when you're walking in different gardens, just you'll be aware of that. A good designer will use the space to create a leisurely movement from one part of the garden to the other. And I'm happy to say that this was restored about 4 years ago. So, and it's also used as a wedding venue for photographs as well as for weddings. But this is another side of the house where it has been very nicely restored. And getting back to the sauce of the architecture, which the architect Thomas Hastings talked about, this is a curved loggia, very similar to what one sees at Villa Giulia in Rome. Villa Giulia was built in the 1500s and is now the Etruscan Museum, and it has this open curved loggia, which is very similar to what is now existing at Templeton. And it's a way to get you can sit in the loggia, so you can be covered if it's rainy or possibly too hot, and you can look out. The loggia at Villa Giulia was used for people to walk in the searing Italian sun. And one more house. Oh, I'm so happy. This one's a charmer. Sefton Manor is in Mill Neck, New York. It was built by a woman, Lillian Sefton Dodge, and her husband, and I call her the early Estee Lauder, or Helena Rubinstein. Her husband founded a cosmetic company, and he died, and she kept it going. And this is what she looks like at Sefton Manor. Sefton Manor is now a school for the deaf, and it's open certain events. They have Halloween events and other things that one can attend. And it was also inspired by English Gothic country house with stylistic references to English houses, because that's what Mrs. Dodge wanted. There are 34 rooms and 16 bathrooms, and there's lead stained glass windows. I've seen them, and they're just wonderful on the front staircase, and they're a series of windows representing 5 Shakespeare plays. And at the time, in 1923, they cost $10,000 each, and they were made in Boston, in the U.S. But craftsmen from Italy and Germany were retained to detail the rest of the interiors. And the front door is claimed to be, I believe it, a solid oak door with studded iron details that's 400 or 500 years old. So the owners imported from England and other parts of Europe items that they wanted. The gardens were designed by Charles Levitt, who called himself a landscape engineer. And you can see the house upper left, and then the garden. And the garden also is in the sundial shape. So this was a motif that was repeated. And that's a 1930s photograph of what the garden looked like. And today it's a sunken garden. One of them is a sunken garden. And that's the edge of it with a pergola. And it's the horticulture, the plant material is not existing, but the masonry elements are all there, including beautiful gates, the gates of the sun and moon, and the stone, which was imported from Westchester, because on Long Island there's actually very little stone, so this was imported from Westchester. So I'm going to end talking about a landscape architect, Beatrice Farren, who was one of the 11 founding members of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And along with Marion Coffin, she led the way for female landscape architects. She did over 100 commissions on Long Island, and sadly, not many of them exist. And this is what one looked like. This is taken off the cover of a book on her, but you can see the elaborate quality of this. This was the William Strait garden with many Asian influences because the owners loved Asia. And also, back to Oheka Castle, Mrs. Kahn wanted something a little more feminine than the very formal garden that her husband asked to be designed. So she hired Beatrice Farren to design many, many garden rooms. There were rooms that were designed, some called the circular room, the circular garden, the octagon garden, and it was much more intimate space. Sadly, today they're no longer existing because they were part of the subdivision. But I walked around there and I've seen some of the walls of Beatrice Farren. But what does still exist is Dunbarton Oaks. So right around the corner from you, Beatrice Farren. This is her greatest existing garden. I don't know if it was the greatest garden, but it's so well maintained by the foundation, by Harvard, which owns it. And you get an idea of her tremendous skill, both with masonry materials, but also with plant material. And here's a reflecting pool, very much a Roman feature with, oh, look, there's those columns again. And with that, I am going to end, and thank you so much. I went over a little bit, but thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
We do. Let's take just a few.
Great, yes.
So, the years that you were talking about, the late 19th century into the 20s, can you give an overall characterization, besides these people all having huge amounts of money? Can you characterize the taste or the artistic sensibility that they left to people, either still standing or torn down? Is there a way to give a characterization to this period of time in this part of Long Island?
So the question is can I characterize the taste and style left, the legacy of the owners of these houses? And I'm going to repeat a word I've used, and it's eclectic. It's all over the map, but yes, they did. And the houses that are open, people come in and look at it, and they look and see what the different tastes were of the time. The real problem is you can't replicate it because it's so expensive. But we tried planting fields. The former director, he went to IKEA and bought a couple of chairs, and then he went to the local fabric mill and he found something that was similar to what was in the pictures. So to answer your question, it's really eclectic. It's all over the map. Yes?
Were these houses mainly used as summer houses or year-round, and they lived in the city?
The question is were these houses used mainly as summer houses, or did they predominantly live in the city? And thank you so much for asking that, because I meant to say that these were absolutely second and third and fourth homes. They were not the main houses. Planting fields, for instance, the owners lived in them, occupied them for 6 weeks a year, in the spring and then Christmas. And they had a house in South Carolina and a house in Montana and, of course, a house in New York. Yes?
Gertrude Whitney's art was sort of avant-garde. It was ahead of the time, but her studio was very traditional. Is there any documentation about why she chose something so traditional?
No, not that I know of. I mean, that's wow. That's something that hadn't occurred to me, because you've hit the nail on the head. She was her art was very progressive. She mingled with progressive artists, and yet her house is designed after an Italian casino. I would say, I'm throwing this out there, but I would say that she wanted a respected architect, and since she was well-traveled, she knew Italy and she knew what an Italian casino looked like, and that's my best guess, but boy, I'm going to work on that question. Yes?
One more. I'm sorry, I'm going for number 2.
That's okay,
This is a twofold question. Number 1, do any of the Frick estates still exist in Glen Cove? And number 2, my next question is the original Sabrina movie. I know it was filmed. The train station still exists. I think it's what, Riverhead, to the Long Island Railroad.
It's Glen Cove.
Glen Cove. Does that house still exist?
So the question is, do any Frick estates exist, and does the, I guess, Sabrina house exist? And yes, there are existing Frick houses. One is a museum, and the gardens were designed by Ellen Biddle Shipman, who was another contemporary of Beatrice Farren and Marion Kruger Coffin. And it's a museum, and it's, I don't know, it doesn't look great, but yes, it still exists. And other Frick houses, there probably are privately owned that I'm not aware of. As far as where Sabrina was filmed, not sure, but you're right. Part of it was filmed in the Glen Cove train station.
I think rumor had it when my grandmother lived in that area. It was like the Pratt Whitney. There was a Pratt Whitney mansion or something outside of Glen Cove. I wonder if that was.
There's lots of Pratt houses. In fact, the Russians live in one of them.
Was there a home on the campus of CW Post where the college is now? Was there a post home?
The question is, was there a post home on the CW campus? Yes, and it still exists. It's an administration building. And Marjorie Merriweather Post lived there after she sold the property to Long Island University, and she was an honorary house mother to 2 of the men's fraternities. Okay.